Many thanks to those who have joined us today. We'll be talking about the changes and developments to our self-assessment questionnaire. These will be coming into effect in February 2020. Towards the end of the webinar today, we will go through plans for the transition and timings of the launch. But in the meantime, today's webinar is really some background about the nature of the changes to the self-assessment questionnaire, rather than anything specific about how you use the tool itself. The self-assessment questionnaire, I'm sure many of you on the call use it and have a lot of experience of it, but for those who don't, self-assessment questionnaire is something that supplier member sites fill out. It's a self-assessment of risk through asking lots and lots of questions about what goes on at the site, who's working there, what activities are happening, what policies and practices are in place, etc. So today's webinar is being presented by me, Rebecca White. I'm the training manager here at Sedex. And alongside me is Alex Sykes. He's an improvement executive at Sedex and someone who has spent an awful lot of time over the last year helping to pull together the self-assessment questionnaire. So it's really great that we have him here today. He'll be presenting with me and also helping to answer questions. So the agenda. We're going to start today by looking at the purpose of the SAQ, why members use it and what they want out of it, and also why we're developing a new tool. We're also going to talk through how the SAQ works for different business types beyond just goods providers, and also what's different and what stays the same in the new SAQ and how it feels to be filling out this new tool. We're then going to break for a question and answer session. We've put 2 in here because there are so many people on the call. Rather than taking questions as they come in, we'll just take them in two sets. Please, I'll just go in a second, I'll go through how you ask questions, but we'll be using the text box. After the first Q&A session, we're going to be going through the benefits for suppliers and buyers of the new self-assessment questionnaire. And finally, we'll be looking at the transition between the tools and the support that we'll be offering at Sedex for that. In terms of housekeeping and how you ask questions, we'll be asking questions using the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll see a little tab that says questions. If you write your questions in there as and when they come to you, and we'll be keeping tabs on those coming in, and then we'll look to answer them in those question sessions. We will be keeping everyone on mute throughout the webinar, so I'm afraid you're not going to be able to ask that in person, but please do write them into the box. If we don't have time to answer your question during the webinar, we will be following up this webinar with an email, and in that we will provide written answers to any questions that don't get answered. And as well as that, we'll be providing a recording of this webinar and a frequently asked questions document that we've created to begin to answer those questions that we see as really helpful and often thought about in relation to the new self-assessment questionnaire. So, starting with why we've developed a new self-assessment questionnaire. Well, the Sedex self-assessment questionnaire is used by customers for 3 key reasons. They are for risk assessment purposes, for data collection by buying organisations and for auditors to help them manage their supply chains. And they might then go on to report against that in annual reports or to NGO organisations. And thirdly, to enable and support supplier improvement. So these are the three key objectives against which we assessed how well the old SAQ functions, and that we sought to work towards in making a new SAQ better and to work harder for us. So moving on then to the process through which we began thinking about and then developing a new SAQ. This started in 2018 with a member consultation and a supplier questionnaire that gained global feedback on the current SAQ and how it's used, as well as what future needs might come out of it. So the supplier questionnaire went out in 6 languages and we had over 300 responses to that. We then, reflecting on the results of that consultation and questionnaire, took our thoughts to external experts for consultation. Along the bottom of the screen, you can see a range of organisations that we spoke to in the process of doing that. And it was through the combination of consultation with members and with experts that we really resolved to develop fully a new question set for the self-assessment questionnaire. Once developed, that's also then been reviewed by Ergon Associates. They are experts in responsible business and responsible sourcing here in the UK. Altogether, there was a really clear need for Sedex to redesign the tool to better deliver against those 3 initial reasons why our membership use the SAQ. So as well as seeking to meet those 3 needs of risk assessment, data collection and supporting supplier improvement, the new SAQ more broadly achieves the following. It has improved the nature of risk assessment. The way we now ask questions through the SAQ is more robust. We have also sought to simplify and reduce the question number. Alex will be going through in more detail later about the number of questions now being asked and how we go about doing that. The new SAQ aligns to SMETA 6.1. And it also incorporates additional questions on gender and responsible recruitment. So there's much more breakdown about the genders working in your supply chain and in what kind of job roles, how they're recruited. And that's very helpful for organisations who want to understand the gender balance in their supply chains and also who are needing to report against those sorts of data points. The new SAQ is also more applicable to more sectors. Previously, the SAQ has been biased perhaps towards goods providers, and now the SAQ works equally well for goods providers, goods and service providers, agents, and labour providers. Again, Alex will talk more about that. The new SAQ also, in terms of how it's been built into the advanced platform, will allow improvement and change over time to be tracked. So this really speaks to the improvement piece and enabling suppliers to show where achievements have been made. There's also an output report for suppliers. Previously, the SAQ provides a report just for buying organisations, but now this is balanced with an output report for suppliers, which will look at the nature of management systems on site and how they're operating, and that will also link to how-to guidance that will support suppliers in improving on weaker areas of management and give help on that front. And finally, this is still in development, but as well as the how-to guidance, we really want to build a more coherent and rounded training and capacity building program that will support and follow up on the SAQ to help suppliers and buying organisations look to improve practice and outcomes for people and workers on the ground. So with that, I'm now going to hand over to Alex Sykes, We've just got to move a headset over, so apologies for the slight pause.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Alex, and I'm the Improvement Executive here at Sedex. I've been working on the self-assessment questionnaire for about a year or so now, so it gives me great joy to be able to present the detail behind what we've been doing, what we've been working on, and our thinking behind it, and hopefully what that might mean and how it might affect you. I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes or so, and then we're going to stop and take some questions. So please use the question box throughout, because I need to, when we stop in 5 minutes time, I'll have a look and be able to get back to you and answer some of your questions. So what we're looking at here is the structure of the SAQ and how it affects different business types. Now it all starts at your site profile. Your site profile is what you create when you join Sedex, and that's information about your company, how many workers you have, and what industry you sit in. Now, the site profile has been changed ever so slightly to go in hand with this SAQ project. What that means is how you select your company and your company type is now derived from something called an ISAQ code. And an ISAQ code is a detailed list of many different business types. And you go down through levels. So let's say, for example, you worked in agriculture, then that would be level 1. Level 2 would be a grower. Level 3 might be a grower of fruits, and level 4 might be a grower of grapes. So you need to select all 4 levels to get you the most specific company type. And this is very important because it gives us a lot of detail, which informs our risk assessment tool. Now, once you have selected your company type, you'll then be pre-populated a SAQ. There's 4 different types of SAQs that you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can either be a goods provider, a service provider, an agent, or a labour provider. This will automatically pre-populate. You can go in and manually change this if you feel that doesn't necessarily match your business type. And just to explain the difference between the 4 business types. So the set of questions is largely similar, but there are some differences. So if you're a goods provider, your questions have been asked about your site that you have, and it will also look into your supply chain and how you manage that. If you're a service provider, then it's slightly different because you probably don't have a site. For example, if you're a cleaning company, you might have an office and then have lots of people or workers operating remotely at customer sites. So these questions are asked at your head office level, but they will also look into your supply chain management as well. If you're an agent, then you're buying goods and then selling them on, then you don't have your own workers, then the focus here will be purely on how you manage that supply chain. And finally, if you're a labour provider, you are providing workers to customer sites. So the focus of this questionnaire is on the risk and how you provide those workers to your customers. In what you'll notice is that previously, or how we work it in the current SAQ, is there are questions that are asked for specific industry types. So anything to do with industry is now covered in the risk assessment tool. And that risk assessment tool is going to pick up on your ISAQ code, which is what I was talking about at the beginning. So the specific nature that you are a grape grower will be picked up by the risk tool. And then the fact that you're a goods provider, that's what triggers your self-assessment questionnaire. So if you're still with me, just to go into a little bit more detail, this is the structure of the new SAQ. We've got 6 sections. We've moved away from the pillars, but I will go on to that. The pillars are environment, business ethics, health and safety, and labour, and that's how it's currently sectored. So I will explain a little bit more about what's happened to those pillars, but they still exist and run throughout the SAQ. But this structure gives us a little bit more of a logical flow of progression. So you'll start talking and providing some general information about your business. You'll then be asked to explain about the different types of policies that are in place. Then you'll go on to explain the processes you have to manage those policies. The next section will look at data that you capture and what data are you capturing. Is that absenteeism rates? Are you looking at worker turnover? Are you looking at environmental impact, for example? And finally, you'll then be asked to speak about what training you provide to your workers and do you have any improvement projects in place? Then once you've completed talking about your business, you'll then go into your supply chain and there'll be a section on how you manage your suppliers and subcontractors. So that's the structure of the SAQ. If you look to the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a section called guidance. So this is something that's quite new for this questionnaire, and it's to help suppliers complete the questionnaire, hopefully make everyone's lives a little bit easier. So the guidance comes in a few different forms. When you get to a new section, it will have an introduction to say what is expected to come up, maybe what colleagues you might need to support the completion of that section, and any documentation. So an example of that is if you got to a section called wages, then we might recommend that you speak to somebody that has access to payroll documents or is from the human resources department before going into that section and completing it. So it's just to provide a little bit of guidance on what to expect coming out of each section of the SAQ. And then we have question-specific tooltips. So these are information which is trying to explain what the question is asking. So it might say, give a bit more detail about what the question means or how you're expected to be answering that. It also might be just providing definitions on wording that's a bit complicated or we think that perhaps might not be as well known. So the guidance is in place to help make this SAQ a lot simpler and easier to complete. So this is a slightly new area for us. Now the questions will differ slightly. One area which we've been asked about a lot is, can the questions from the current SAQ be moved across into the new SAQ? And the answer is no, because we changed the answer format slightly. So all the questions have been refreshed and updated, but whereas before a lot of the questioning was a yes/no answer format, so it's quite leading in how you would respond to that, because you would be likely to have a clear idea of what your answer is. So we're moving away from do you have so and so in place, yes or no, and we're now going to ask what do you have in place, and it'll give you a multiple choice options. So you would then go through those options and select all that are applicable to you. Now you always have the option to suggest that this isn't applicable to me, or you don't know the answer. So I don't know is a new option. It appears throughout the questionnaire. And the reason we put this in is because in our current questionnaire, we're finding that a lot of respondents are leaving questions blank. We did a survey and we looked at a specific set of questions, and it was almost 50% of the respondents were skipping them or leaving them blank. So to try and avoid that and provide a little bit more help to both buyer and supplier, we've now introduced this I don't know option. What this will do, if you can't just still go through the whole questionnaire, answer I don't know, and get to the end, that's still going to trigger a message back to your buyer. So if where I don't know has been selected, this will trigger information back to the buyer to say that maybe a little bit more support's needed in that area, or there's a little more explanation or training to be provided. And we're hopefully using it as a way in which before something would be skipped and it doesn't really tell much of a story of what's going on. Now there's an opportunity for both the buyer and the supplier to see where either a lack of understanding or maybe just more training is needed and improvements can be made in that area. The last point I just want to say on questions is we are asking for more data to be requested by gender. So an example I've put here is if you're giving information on worker committee or trade union and how many members of your workers are involved in a trade union, you'll be asked to split it out by male and female. This provides a lot more information back to your buyer. If you're unable to provide that information, because we understand it's not always as straightforward and it's a little bit more complicated, then you can still go down and just enter totals. But this provides an option for more gender disaggregated data to be provided throughout the SAQ. So we ask 3 different types of questions really that run throughout the SAQ. You'll be asked questions about your business, for example, which countries do you source from and how many buildings are on site. You'll also be asked questions about your workers that you have, which contracts are you using for your workers, what are the nationalities and what methods are you using to pay them. And finally, we'll be asking questions around how you manage risk. So do you review practices of labour providers that will be applicable if you have agency workers? Or how many grievances have been raised in your company in the past 12 months? So 3 different areas, I would say. So any questions about your business, about your workers, and about how you manage risk. Now, looking at question numbers, I'm sure lots of people are wondering whether it's going to be a shorter questionnaire, a longer questionnaire, and it does depend a little bit now on your business type. So if you look at this table that is on the screen here, you can see the 4 different business types that we explained earlier, the 4 different SAQs that you could complete. So if you're a goods provider, there's a maximum number of questions that you'd be answering is 311, and the minimum you can ask is 99. And you can see it goes throughout. The agent is the shortest questionnaire because the focus of this is purely on supply chain management. And the labour providers is a little bit shorter as well compared to the goods and service provider. So the reason why we have maximum and minimum, which is slightly different from where we were before, is the amount of complexity or the amount of information your site has, you will then be asked to provide more. And what I mean by that is if you provide accommodation to your workers, when you come to the accommodation section, you would select yes. You'll then be asked a follow-up set of questions on what type of accommodation it is, where it is, what facilities are involved in it. So we're looking to get the detail for those people that have these policies or practices in place. If you're a smaller organization and you're not providing any of that, then you'll skip that question and you'll move on to the next section. So that's why we have minimums and maximums. It's there to be relevant for the business type that's completing the questionnaire. If the business has more going on and more to show off, you will be asked more questions, but it also feeds through to improvement. So you will be able to show more improvement back to your buyer. So answering more questions isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's basically a way of showing off a lot more that you're doing. But the question set will only be relevant. So I'm just going to go into a bit more detail about why that is. So down here on the left-hand side, you can see the different sections that we explained earlier. These have been split off into maximum and minimum question numbers. And a good example of what we mean here is if you look at section 3, which is processes, and you can almost reduce your question set by 50% if you were at the minimum end. So if you had agency workers and you use labour providers, you would then be asked to complete a question set on that. If you had accommodation in place, as explained earlier, you'd be asked to complete a question set on that. If you provide transport to workers, if you measure your environmental impact, so on and so forth. So you get a bit of an understanding as to the more we have in place, the more questions we're going to be asked. And if we're a smaller organisation, the less we have in place, or the less questions you'll be asked. Hopefully that makes sense. So I've spoken to you a lot about changes and what we're doing differently and how we're hoping that's going to benefit both buyer and supplier. But some really key elements will remain the same. If the content that I've just shared is different in that the sections aren't based off the 4 SMETA pillars. The 4 SMETA pillars are health and safety, business ethics, environment, and labour. So these key themes will run throughout the SAQ, throughout those sections, rather than being a section on their own. The location of where you'll find the SAQ is still in the same place. It's still hosted in Sedex Advanced, and the functionality remains the same. And then from a languages perspective, we will be launching this SAQ in the same 13 languages that are currently in use today. So with all that in mind, I think comes a good point to just answer a few of your questions that are coming in. So we'll answer questions for a few minutes or so. So please keep sending them through, and I'll hopefully be able to get back to you and let you know what's going on.
Hello, and Bex here. Many thanks indeed for your questions coming in. I'm going to start with one sent in from Unati. They ask, will the output report made available to suppliers be made available to the buyer organisation at the same time, or is there a delay for suppliers to assess the report before submitting to the buyer for review? My understanding is that the report is created simultaneously at the same time for buyer organisations and supplier organisations. The supplier report takes a subset of the report sent to buyers and puts it into a supplier facing report. So there won't be a delay. It will be made available at the same time. Achana asks whether a jewelry manufacturer is a goods provider. Yes. So a goods provider makes things. Service provider sells a service like cleaning or transport or security or banking. A labour provider sells sort of people's labour. Moving on, Jan Hopmans asks whether the SAQ will be available in Dutch. This is one of the 13 languages existing, we think, and therefore it will be. And Vicky asks, and makes a good point. We've heard this from users before, that it is in the past been quite difficult to select multiple answers, and we have changed this in the new SAQ. So rather than having to sort of press Control Alt and select multiple answers, we will instead have a tick box system in the new SAQ. So we've had some more questions coming in. I'm going to hand over to Alex to answer some of those.
There's a lot of questions around timelines, delivery dates, what support is going to be offered. That's all coming up in the second part of the webinar that Bex will present, so I won't go over her part. We have an interesting question from, I think it's Barbara, which is asking if the SAQ is aligned with the SDGs, the SDGs being the Sustainable Development Goals. So the SAQ was written in alignment with something called the United Nations Guiding Principles, which is a framework similar to the SDGs, but a little bit different, and it's one that we at Sedex align with and focus on. We do have a strong alignment with the SDGs. If you're interested, we have an SDG report out on our website. If you just search or Google Sedex Sustainable Development Goals, there's a really interesting report about how all our members are working towards the goals. This SAQ will definitely cover off a lot of the goals, so you can work in alignment with that. We won't be releasing at launch any reports or any alignment with that, but that could be something that comes along a little bit further down the line in the future. Some other slightly more technical questions around will the slides be shared and will there be a copy of this webinar, that it will all be hosted on our website for you to be able to access after this webinar. Some questions about how this affects the risk assessment tool, which is excellent, really good question. So we have split our webinars into there's so much information to really provide. So this one is purely on the self-assessment questionnaire. I would urge you to sign up and attend one of our risk assessment tool webinars, and that will provide you a little bit more information about the link and how the information from the completed question set feeds into the risk assessment tool. And a question from Zanita, which is asking, is there a separate environmental SAQ to complete? There is no separate SAQs currently. So there is an environmental section within this SAQ, which we have improved from the current version. It's a little bit more detailed. It will ask you elements around water, waste, emissions, pollution, energy, biodiversity, and raw material extraction. And we will also be asking around data that's tracked on environmental emissions, for example, and what reduction targets are in place. And we've got one more on the asking around the functionality of the global SAQ. So just to explain this in a bit more detail, the global SAQ is a set of questions that are within the question set. These questions can be made applicable to all of your sites. So I mean, the functionality does still exist, is the answer to your question. The way it works is that you'll have the option to complete around about, I'm going to say, I don't know the exact number, it's 10 to 15 questions, the answers of which you can then make applicable to all of your sites. So an example of that would be, do you have a certifications in place, and all of the certifications that you answer, you can then make applicable to your sites so that when they come to fill out their SAQ, they can already see that answer has been pre-populated. So yes, that functionality remains. And with that, I'm going to switch back to Bex, who's going to explain a little bit more about the rollout of the SAQ and the support on offer from Sedex. Thank you.
Many thanks, Alex, and thanks so much everyone for all your questions. As we said, if we don't get around to answering a question in this session, we will be providing written answers to those in a follow-up email, and that email will also include a link to a recording of this webinar, so you can also share it with colleagues or rewatch it. Okay, so firstly, we're just going to talk briefly about how we see the SAQ working for suppliers and buyers and the benefits we see coming from this new SAQ. The first one is that, as I mentioned previously, suppliers will now receive an output report once the SAQ is complete. And this will be including a table like the one shown on the right of the screen. Along the top is a breakdown of the different areas of a management system, really. So having policy in place and the resource in terms of people or money to support that, the process through which you would put that policy into practice, any monitoring and tracking systems you have in place to ensure that that policy is achieving what it sets out to do, and then training and improvement programs that would then seek to improve outcomes in line with that policy area. And then along the left-hand side of the box, you can see the Sedex 4 pillars: labour, health and safety, business ethics and environment. And then there's another one there, which is supply chain management, which takes into account how sites, but also agents manage their supply chains. So as you can see, we just use the basic green, amber, red type colour scheme to reflect back in this report how well the site or the business is performing against these different elements of a management system. And what we hope is that that is a really helpful guide to highlighting the areas in which there is weaker practice, more help, more support, greater emphasis and on training and improvement could be done. So the report will not only have this box, but it will also link through from these measures into our new supplier workbook. I'll talk a bit more about this in detail later, but the supplier workbook will be available in digital format and hard format, and will really take each issue area. So within labour standards, it will break that down into each issue area within labour, and will highlight what good practice looks like, how you can begin to put that into practice on your site, what a good monitoring and tracking system looks like, what examples and case studies of good training and improvement programs. So where the supplier facing report, when it comes in, there will be links. Where there is poorer or weaker practice, there will be links from that report into the corresponding chapter in the supplier workbook, which will begin to lay out what you can do to change that situation. So to summarise, the supplier report shows what needs to be done to improve, and the workbook will explain why and how that can happen. So a second area of benefit we see is that suppliers can show improvement to customers, because you can both highlight improvement actions that have taken place in your business or at your site, and because the new SAQ and advanced system will enable the show of change over time. It's a really great way in which to log and share progress, both within your business but with your customer base as well. And finally, as Alex has really nicely laid out, we hope that the SAQ is an easier exercise to undertake. The addition of I don't know and the use of guidance and the slimmed down question set altogether, we hope, makes for a better user experience for suppliers using the self-assessment questionnaire. So moving on to thinking about benefits for buyers, we see this coming through an improved risk assessment with the nature of questions asked and the style of those questions, the ability to differentiate suppliers who are going above and beyond versus those that are working at the minimum, and also then to encourage and work with those supplier organisations to show improvement over time, and to support them in doing that, and to recognise that effort. It can be used now for a greater diversity of business types, as Alex laid out, and that we're collecting more gender disaggregated information, which feeds into the last point in terms of helping to better report to organisations such as Oxfam and the Workforce Disclosure Initiative to show what you are doing as a business. So the hotly anticipated question is, of course, when is this all going to happen? So this is quite a busy slide, but I'll take you through it from the left. So at present, we are using the SAQ as it is, and we use that in conjunction for buyer and buyer supplier members with our risk assessment tool. So they will remain in place until mid-February, when we are launching the new self-assessment questionnaire. That's when the new self-assessment questionnaire goes live. Within a month, we will then also be launching the new risk assessment tool. So in March 2020 is when the new risk assessment tool will be launched. We're doing it in that staggered way because we appreciate these are two big changes, and we want to launch the SAQ first because it feeds into the risk assessment tool, and to make sure that that is bedded in, that it's working well, and that we are providing the kind of training and support needed to make sure that that goes smoothly. At the point when the new SAQ launches, the old SAQ will enter read-only mode. However, the risk data, which is used with the SAQ in the risk assessment tool, will remain available for 12 months after the launch of the risk assessment tool. So that will also mean that we have a side-by-side risk score comparison report available to our buyer and buyer supplier, or A and AB members. And on advanced, you will also be able to see completion rates of the old SAQ and the new SAQ. So importantly, we'll then have a year from the launch, from March 2020 through to March 2021, during which we will be strongly encouraging members who fill out the SAQ to fill out the new SAQ. But there will be a 12-month transition period, so 12 months of time to get that completed before the Verisk Maplecroft risk data is no longer available on our system. And we would be removing visibility of old SAQ information after a minimum of 12 months, but we will be consulting with members on when that should happen. So I hope that that's clear and has answered your questions in terms of launch and transition plans. So what kind of training and support are we going to be offering for this transition? Well, as we are talking now, we're at the beginning of this phase at the end of 2019, where we are running a series of 4 webinars looking at the new self-assessment questionnaire, looking at risk assessment and how we do that well, and looking at the new risk assessment tool and hearing from members. We will also be providing the frequently asked question sets, which I mentioned, that will go out with the email after this webinar by the end of this week, and guidance documents, as well as we're building a new self-assessment questionnaire and risk assessment tool area of our website, and that will be the go-to place for documents, recordings of webinars, information. So at launch time, so February, March 2020, we will then be going into an intensive period of training on the tools themselves, how they feel and work on the system, how you use them. We'll be providing methodology documentation about the tools. And of course, as always, as now and as always, there will be member services and account management support for our members on this. Finally, in terms of following up and just ensuring that once people have started to use the SAQ, we will be providing support in the form of the supplier workbook and reminders on the system and by email to encourage filling out of the new SAQ. So just to talk about the launch of the self-assessment questionnaire, what will be involved in the training? We'll be running webinars on the changes to the SAQ, how we're transitioning, the supplier report and how you can use it well and how it works, how you can get the most out of it, as well as an introduction to the supplier workbook and how you can use that to begin thinking about improvement on your site. We will have supporting documents in terms of a fuller set of frequently asked questions, because all the questions you're asking during these webinars, any training we do now, is all feeding into wanting to provide good support for our membership at launch. And there will be an SAQ methodology document. We will be running that support training in Spanish, Chinese, Mandarin, and English at the very least. And in an ongoing sense, we appreciate that different suppliers will be getting into the new SAQ at different times during the year, and buying organisations. So we're going to phase that training on the new SAQ and ensure that at different points in the year, we're really pushing and supporting in terms of webinars and guidance and communication. On the system, the SAQ reminder emails will be sent to members that are not completing the SAQ. There'll be pop-up reminders on advance, and we'll be able to see completion of old and new SAQ through analytics. Just a little bit about the Sedex supplier workbook. This is the front cover of our workbook that we have at the moment. It was published in 2014 and authored by Verite, who are very well respected organisation who work on fair labour, responsible business and sourcing. It has chapters on each of the different issue areas within SMETA, and it takes a set format which goes through definitions, benefits, requirements, and how you achieve and maintain standards. It's full of a lot of case studies and there's a lot of resource materials. So it's a really fantastic resource, and we are getting that updated, and it will be launched with the new SAQ. The updated version will have a much nicer user interface with more graphics, troubleshooting sections on how to handle difficult situations, self-assessment checklist to help you to make sure that you know what needs to happen at your site or in your business in order to be compliant and have everything in place. We'll have guidance on how you undertake root cause analysis. So where you do have an issue on site, how do you get to the bottom of what's causing that issue? And finally, lots on case studies and an enhanced section on business KPIs, key performance indicators, because we ask more questions about key performance indicators in the SAQ. This will be available in 12 languages. And as I said before, there will be links to relevant chapters from the supplier-facing report. So we have come to the end of our presentation, and we hope that that has helped to fill you in a bit on what the SAQ is looking like, how it's shaping up, and when we'll be transitioning to this new tool. We've got a Q&A session now. We've got about 10 minutes, and I think there are plenty of questions coming in, which is great. Many thanks indeed. I'm going to hand over to Alex to start that process.
Thank you. So first question is from Dave. So Dave's asking, will the improvement report look to the old SAQ data to show improvement? The answer is no. So when you enter, and that's really because the question set is completely different. So when you complete the new SAQ for the first time, you could then come back and update it in 2 months. That's when you'll be able to see the improvement. So it's when the new SAQ is being updated, it's not going to be able to look to the current one that's in use. Just a note around supports that we have to help with this transition. We know it's quite significant and big, these changes. So if you're a supplier, then we have a help desk who are on hand to help you out. And if you're a buyer member, you should have a dedicated account manager. And lots of what we've been talking about today is slightly different in that we're talking about improvement and why and how you should improve. So the account management team will be helping members give examples of how to write this into your company policy. So do make the most use out of the account management team on offer as well. Question from Jan asking, how long will it take to complete the questionnaire? So I think if we just look back to think back to some of the slides I was sharing earlier, it does depend a little bit on your business setup, and how much you have in place is how many questions you'll then be asking. This one will probably take a little bit longer because it's new and the question set is going to be different and new, and when you come back to update it, it should be quicker. Also, if it's the first time you've ever completed a self-assessment questionnaire on your business, the likelihood is it will take slightly longer. So I think if it's the first time, maybe a little bit longer. First time doing this questionnaire, it could be a little bit longer. But once you're into the flow of things, then it should be fine. And it does depend, of course, on your business type. Question from Anna, so asking, do B members are suppliers, so they get access to the SAQ reports? Yes, so supplier members will have an output report that when you finish your questionnaire and you complete it and you submit it to the buyer, you then have a report that comes back. That report will show you your strengths and where improvements are needed. and it will link you through to the relevant section of the supplier workbook. So the supplier workbook is full of useful information explaining different areas of what you've been asked in the questionnaire, and how and what the risks or what the issues might be, and how you can make improvements on that. There'll be case studies in there, so you can see what other organisations have done who are facing similar scenarios as yourself. So yes, you will have access to the reports, and that will link through to the relevant training material as well. There's a question on languages from Emma. Emma's asking if the report will be available in all 13 languages, and I've got nodding to my left. So yes, the output reports are available in the same 13 languages that the SAQ will be made available in. There's some questions around audits, and what should we do if we have audits in place? Should we wait? Should we go ahead? It depends a little bit, but my advice would be to go ahead. So the launch of this SAQ will be in February. We would then keep the current one running for 12 months. So if you have a current SAQ in place and you're due to have an audit, I would carry on and go through with that process, and then make your transition over to the new SAQ, which will be live until approximately February 2021. In which case that will then feed into all new audits. So that would be my advice, but I would recommend with that one speaking to either our help desk or your account manager, just to get the best advice on what to do in your situation. Question from Lena, which is asking, how do I find our ISIC code? So just a reminder, the ISIC code is a code which is relevant to describe your business type. Our company has many different divisions and different business areas, and I can't find one code that would describe everything. So it's a really good question. You can find your ISIC code in your profile in Sedex Advanced. We currently use a different format, so you won't have ISIC. ISIC is similar to what is currently in use, but it's a little bit more detailed. Hopefully with that detail, it'll be much easier to then be able to select what your company's doing. You can select primary activity, and if you believe that you want to select several other options, then you can go into a secondary activity as well. So there are options to select multiple different codes. You won't. So what I was trying to say is you won't be able to select it now, but when this new SAQ is launched, have a look at your site profile. You'll actually be requested, or there'll be a pop-up to ask you to update your site profile, and within that update, you'll find the area to select your new ISIC code. You can also just search. Sometimes people might find the navigation a bit tricky, so you can just search for what you do. So if you're a mango grower but you weren't sure how you'd go through the different categories to get there, if you search mangoes, it will automatically provide you with that link back.
Hello, it's Bex here. Just a couple more questions. There was a question actually two questions from Emma. I think it's the same Emma. There was one about what languages this webinar would be available in. What we're doing is recording this webinar, and then we will be liaising with our colleagues in Latin America and China to get this recording translated into Chinese Mandarin and Spanish at the very least. I'm also thinking hopefully to get it into Hindi as well. This will take a little bit of time, but we will be in touch with everyone who has attended these webinars, and all members actually, about availability of this in other languages. We hope that can be in place by the end of this year. The second question was about help desk and their ability to support and help on this. From launch, they will be fully trained in the new SAQ, and so we hope to provide a really good support service from them in terms of how to fill in the new SAQ and what functionality it has. I think I think that that's probably all of the questions. Just to add on to the question about the SAQ and audits, the new SAQ doesn't affect existing audits that are due to happen. So just keep going with what you have planned. But otherwise, I think that that's all the questions. I just wanted to say a huge thank you for joining us today. Do encourage colleagues that you think need to hear this webinar to join. We've got 2 more sessions running, but also, as I said, it will be recorded and sent to you with the FAQ and questions in writing that weren't answered today. Without further ado, have a good rest of day or evening. Thank you. Bye.